Welcome back. What follows is the first complete rendering of the taped interview between Brockney and Scott Peterson, including those portions not admitted at trial. Detective Brockney started a tape recorder, then began to speak. Pretty much, Scott. We'll just go over what we already talked about so I can make some notes. Scott mumbled his agreement. Tell me about the morning. Very matter-of-factly, Scott recited their activities. Okay, I don't know what time we got up, but he did say that Lacey was up first and had cereal for breakfast. He noted that his pregnant wife got sick if she did not eat as soon as she got out of bed. I laid around in bed longer. I got up, 8 o'clock or so. Brockney noted that Scott made no mention of anybody making the bed. I showered. We were watching her favorite show, Martha Stewart, live. Watched a little bit of that. You didn't watch the whole thing, though? Detective Brockney interjected. No. You remember what part you saw? I don't know. Some cooking deal, cookies of some sort. They were talking about what to do with meringue. This trivial fact would become a crucial reference point at trial, one that would prove embarrassing for the prosecution, but even more demanding for Scott. I can't remember your house, the converted garage area. Is that your TV room? The detective asked. Yeah. Did you eat any breakfast? I had a bowl of cereal. The event Scott described in the first interview struck me as odd when I first reviewed the transcript of this conversation. Police photographs in the kitchen showed no cereal bowls or other breakfast dishes in the sink. There were bowls in the dishwasher, but no one looked in the refrigerator to see if Lacey had begun marinating French toast for her brunch the next day, as Scott would later claim. This item would have been evidence that she was alive in the morning hours of Christmas Eve. Of course, if Lacey had cleaned the kitchen that morning, that would have been one more activity, along with mopping the floor and possibly making the bed, that would have delayed her walk with Mackenzie. Okay, the detective prompted. When did you realize you were gonna go fishing? That was a morning decision. That's a morning decision? Brockney asked. Go play golf at the club or go fishing, Scott said. Okay. It seemed too cold to go play golf at the club, Scott chuckled. So yeah, decided might as well. For a passionate golfer, it is rarely too cold to play. However, Christmas Eve out on the bay in 14-foot boat sounds awfully chilly. Lacey told me what she was gonna do for the day, Scott volunteered. And what was that? She was gonna finish cleaning up, like I said. She was mopping the kitchen floor, then take the dog for a walk, and then she was going to the store to buy for Christmas morning breakfast tomorrow. That was gonna involve prepping for the breakfast, and she was gonna make gingerbread cookies for the night, Scott explained. What was she mopping? Brockney asked. The tile in the entry area. When the detective pressed him to be precise, Scott specified that it was the back entry area. Right, where the mops were outside, Brockney asked, his dark eyes peering over his glasses to watch the young man's response. No. Scott said she was working in the area that led out of the back patio. There was a lot of places she planned to go, he continued. She had me put the bucket by the front door. So she asked you to put the mop bucket by the front door, Brockney repeated. Yeah, she's, 8 months pregnant, can't pick it up for anything, so I filled it up for her, put it in. I think that's the central place. Scott didn't seem aware of the mounting inconsistencies of his story. Lacey wouldn't have been able to move the bucket, yet he left it some distance from where she was cleaning. For that matter, the mops would have been very difficult for her to use in her condition, as they required someone to bend over and to wring out the excess water by hand before moving them around the house. Did you move the bucket back when you came home? How did it get outside? Yeah. So you put it out there? Scott mumbled his agreement. The dog and the cat ran in. Yeah, she wasn't about to lift anything heavy. Brockney shifted to another subject. When you left, do you remember what she was wearing? Scott described black pants and a long-sleeved t-shirt without any printing on it. She had not been wearing a jacket or shoes at the time. No shoes, Detective Brockney asked. Later, Scott said that she usually wore white tennis shoes on walks with the dog. As for her jacket, he commented, she usually steals my stuff. She steals your stuff? Yeah, because, instead of maternity stuff, so I don't really know. You don't know, Brockney pressed. She could have had hers or mine or nothing, I don't know, Scott continued. Brockney never asked if these items were missing. He later learned that Scott hadn't bothered to check. Detective Brockney touched upon several more topics before turning to Scott's fishing trip. Okay, then you hooked your boat up. Scott muttered in the affirmative. About what time did you leave Modesto? Gosh, I don't know. Extrapolate what time I got, noon. Is that right? Yeah, no, one? Which one is it? Scott demanded, referring to the marina receipt he had provided earlier. Shit, I don't know, Detective Brockney admitted. Tuesday time, 12:54 on December 24th. Okay, so you got there at 1 o'clock. I got there at 1, Scott repeated. That should take at least an hour and a half. Yeah, okay. It would be 11:30 or about, Brockney calculated. Probably longer than that, because you can't go over 55 with that trailer, Scott explained. Did you drive straight there? I did. You stopped for lunch? Detective Brockney asked. No. Did you buy bait? Nope. I'm not a bait fisherman, Scott declared. You didn't buy no lunch, didn't eat anything? The investigator persisted. Nothing, Scott insisted. I was damn hungry with the pizza when I got home. Having established that Scott had arrived at the marina at about 5 minutes to 1, Brockney asked how long he had stayed on the water. Scott could only estimate, only about an hour and a half. Did you take the chart of the area with him? Did he take the chart of the area with him? Scott said no. What, you just winged it? Brockney asked. Scott nodded. Did you go very far? No, probably a couple miles. I went north, found a little island kind of deal there. The detective nodded. In an island that had a bunch of trash on it. I remember a big sign that said no landing. It looked like some broken piers around it. I just assumed it would be decent, shallow area. Did you troll? A little bit. A lot. A lot of the reason I went was just to get that boat in the water to see, Scott had told the police earlier that he had been fishing for sturgeon, but they would soon learn that his experience with sturgeon fishing was limited at best. If that was truly what he'd been doing, he'd chosen the wrong season and the wrong equipment. Furthermore, it was actually illegal to troll for that fish. Scott's cell phone rang. It was Lacey's younger half-sister, Amy, calling to say that she and several other family members were back at his house. Amy, Brockney inquired. Yeah, Scott replied without elaboration. Is that Lacey's sister? Uh-huh. Different mothers, same father, he said dryly. Brockney was struck that Scott did not ask his sister-in-law a single question about the search for his wife. Reading the transcript, so was I. If my family member was missing, the first words out of my mouth on any new phone call would have been, "Did you find her? Have you heard anything?" Yet Scott didn't ask Amy anything. He must have known the answers. "Okay, so you fish 90 minutes and then what? You go back to the marina?" the detective continued. "Uh-huh. You see somebody? You talk to anybody out there?" "I talked to a couple of guys fishing. They asked me, 'Did you catch anything?' They didn't either. The guys working, fixing maintenance guys. Got a good laugh with me trying to get back down the trailer," he explained, grinning. These individuals, if real, never emerged to testify at trial. "Okay, then what? You drive. How did you get there?" Scott described his route to the Berkeley Marina along Highway 580 to 250 North. "You came home the same way?" "Yeah," Scott replied. "You have to stop for gas?" "Stop for gas in Livermore or Pleasanton. I think it was the Chevron station. There are buses around." "How'd you pay?" Scott told the officers he used a credit card, but he had no receipt. "Debit or credit card?" "I don't know which way they count it, debit or credit, when it sticks it in there," Scott answered. "Okay, when you got in the car, who did you call?" "I called Lacey, as I was leaving the marina." "Home phone?" Brockney asked. Scott said he had called the phone number and Lacey's mobile phone, leaving messages on both. He gave Brockney her cell phone and password, but said he didn't know if the calls were time-stamped. "Try it out," Scott said. Brockney listened to the messages, noting that the times were exactly as Scott said. He made no mention of his contemporaneous conversations with his father or his friend Greg Reed. Both men enjoyed fishing, but Scott said nothing to them about his new boat or his trip to the bay. After gassing up, Scott drove straight to the warehouse to drop off the boat and then went home. Brockney cleared his throat before asking the next question. "When you left, what were you wearing?" "Blue jeans and a blue t-shirt." "And what shoes?" Timberland." "Which jacket?" Scott paused. "Did you leave your jacket in the truck?" the detective interrupted. "When I left the house, I didn't have a jacket on, but I had, when I was at the warehouse, I had that green pullover on that was in my truck. When it started raining, I had a camo jacket on the boat and a tan hat." "Okay, and then you went back to the shop. You unhooked the boat?" "Uh-huh." "Did you do anything else?" "No, I guess I saw that fax, and I was late getting home, so I went straight home," Scott responded. "Did you try to call anyone?" Brockney pressed. "Just once from the marina, both phones, and then later on, I left a second message on her mobile." "There was only one from you." "Well, I left two at home, and I thought I left two on the mobile. Maybe I didn't leave the second one on the mobile," he conceded. "One was when I left Berkeley, and the other was, when I was driving to Livermore. The traffic was pretty bad, and I knew I wouldn't be home by 4, so I gave her a call." When he got home, Scott backed his car into the driveway next to Lacey's SUV, then entered into the house. Through the backyard, when he found Mackenzie dragging his leash, Scott removed the leash and placed it on the patio table. Entering the house through the French doors, he noticed that they were unlocked. He related his movements for Brockney, dumping the mop water and then washing his clothes. "Were you calling for Lacey?" Brockney wanted to know. "Oh yeah, of course," Scott assured him. "But she wasn't home." "No. I assumed that she was at her mom's." "Okay, and then what?" "I grabbed some pizza from the fridge, and then he went to take a shower." "Did you call her mom?" "After I got out of the shower and put clothes on, that's when I checked the messages." "Were there any?" "Yeah." "Yours?" "There were 3, 2 from me, 1 from Ron, her stepfather, asking for whipped cream When he came over, with an air annoyance, he added, "That's when I said, 'Hey man, he's calling me for whipped cream.'" "Did you erase them?" "No." The detective made a mental note. Most people erase unnecessary messages unless there was some other reason to keep them, like an alibi. "Okay, so then you called over to her mom's?" "That's right." "Had you heard from her?" "No, not at all. Not all day." "Was that unusual?" "No, I think we're supposed to be there for dinner at 6 or 6:30. "Okay, so you told Sharon, and did you talk to Ron?" Talk to Mom, Sharon. I asked if Lacey was there, and she told me no." "Who called us?" the detective asked. "Ron." "Did he tell you he was going to call?" "Yeah." Who all did you call? Other people then?" Scott said that he immediately called Lacey's closest friends, Stacy and Renee. He pointed out that he'd opened the phone to start calling hospitals when Sharon rang, but admitted that he wasn't sure about the sequence. According to Scott, Sharon said that they would call the police. He should check with the neighbors and then look into the park. "I mean, I may have checked the neighbors and then came back and got the phone." "Had any of your neighbors heard or seen anything?" Brockney asked. First neighbor I checked with was directly across the street. Her name's Amy." He was referring to Amy Krigbaum, who lived at 5... She lived across the street with her roommate, Tara Venable. Scott left a note with his next door neighbor, Karen Servas. She was the person who later told Scott about finding Mackenzie running loose with his leash on whatever the actual order of events less than 15 minutes transpired between Scott's first call and to Sharon and her insistence that he go look in the park. "Was there anything unusual out of the ordinary in your house?" "The only unusual things were the leash and the door unlocked." "How about the gun?" "How long has it been in your car?" Scott explained that the .22 caliber had been in his glove box about a month. Scott had bought a pistol on his trip to Lone Pine with his father to shoot pheasant. "I tried to shoot it once on the trip, but it didn't go off." The president, sorry, I was watching the news before this. The detective shifted the focus. "Have you guys had any problems, marriage problems?" "No," Scott assured him. "Everything is good?" "Uh-huh." "And you have been married for years?" "Yeah, 4 or 5, I'm thinking. I think this is 5. I got married in 97. Shifting again, Brockney asked about the park. "Times you've walked in the park said that, you've seen campers, bums, or whatever. Has Lacey ever complained to you that somebody was bothering her?" "Nah," Scott replied. "I mean, like I said, I don't usually think they'd come up to her and accost her in any way, you know. She has times she's felt uncomfortable, and thankfully she's got the dog. We've called the police a couple of times about people down there just to get them moving along, you know. And it's uncommon for Lacey or myself to wake one of those guys or ladies up and tell them to get lost." At this point, Scott still seemed convinced that Mackenzie would have warded off any attackers. Later, he would change his story and assert that his wife was probably accosted in the park for her jewelry. The interview moved on to the Petersons' housekeeper, Margarita. Maggie, or Margarita, she was there on Monday, and obviously she did a lot of work because the house wasn't filthy. "Why was your wife mopping on a Tuesday morning?" "I don't know, got me. I mean, she was pretty fastidious about it, though," Scott replied, describing his wife in past tense. "Was she?" Brockney asked. "With the dog and the cat and her doing the Christmas deal, that was pretty common," he added. "Yeah, she was always had the vacuum or the mop out." The past tense again. You haven't fired any guns today, Detective Brockney asked. No, it's been a month since the trip to Lone Pine. Brockney asked Scott if they could test the gunshot residue on his hands. Scott hesitated as the detective produced a gunshot residue kit. He asked, Will boat motor exhaust register positive? Would you be willing to take a polygraph? Brockney responded. Sure, Scott replied, but Brockney noticed Scott was shaking his head from side to side, indicating no. So what you're telling me, Scott, is that you have no idea where Lacey is? None. Just to eliminate you as a suspect, would you be willing to take a polygraph? The detective repeated. Yeah, they're accurate, right? Yeah, Brockney assured him. I mean, it's nothing that can be used against you, but yeah, I believe they're accurate. No, I'm certainly willing, Brockney added. It wouldn't be now. It'd be, in a day or two. It's just like the next step in this thing. Sure, Scott replied. Really, the detective concluded. What's left is the flyers, the canvases tomorrow, and the media coverage. What concerns me the most is the fact that your dog came home with the leash on. That bothers me. No question, Scott agreed. The interview was wrapped when Scott asked something quite surprising. The only question I have, what resources available? You saw my mother-in-law tonight. Anyways, you saw some of my friends, myself. What do you mean? Counseling, that kind of thing. Can you give us the numbers, or do you have to search? No, I can give you those numbers. I just don't know. You're probably not going to get any answers today. It's Christmas, of course. It's Christmas, I mean. Yeah, of course, and there is no need to call if we find Lacey in the next days. Yeah, I agree. I'll give you those numbers. I will need them. The question is chillingly obvious. How was Scott so sure that he would need counseling only hours after Lacey disappeared? Families of missing people are genuinely so caught up in the moment and clinging so dearly in hope that it's some time before counseling comes into play. Often investigation and trial in a murder case so focuses the family that it's not until well after the verdict that members really acknowledge their grief and turn to counselors. Yet Scott was already sure he'd need that kind of assistance only hours into the search. I'll get you the number for victim services, Brockney replied. The interview was over. It was almost 1:30 a.m. Looking directly at Scott, Brockney made a vow. We'll get the bastard who did this to Lacey. He wanted Scott to know that he didn't believe Lacey had just wandered off. He already believed she was dead, and he was not going to let go of this case until he solved it. I believe it was at this moment that the lines were drawn. Scott's deadly game now involved the police. Scott's demeanor was an issue from the start of the investigation. His family attorney and a gaggle of television pundits would make their excuses about how we all respond to tragedy and argue that nothing should be read into the young husband's seemingly callous behavior. However, years of observing human nature would lead the experienced detectives to a different conclusion. After the interview, Brockney carefully recorded that Scott appeared casual and nonchalant, bored, tired, and devoid of urgency. I think most people would agree that an innocent husband whose pregnant wife is missing would show at least some emotion. Scott Peters showed none of that kind. At the time, it might have been argued that he was simply trying to appear strong around the cops. But in the weeks that followed, he would demonstrate an extraordinary ability to turn his feelings on and off at will. In his private behavior with Amber Fry and during his public interviews with female members of the media. It was Detective Al Brockney who first noted Scott's strange behavior. Additionally, in his immediate search for Scott's truck, he spotted items that were removed only hours later, including the umbrellas, the tarps, jacket, and lures. By acting fast, he managed to survey Scott's workplace before anyone could clean up the concrete particles or erase the computer hard drives. Had Detective Brockney followed standard procedure and treated Lacey's disappearance as a standard missing persons case, that valuable evidence might have been lost. Way to go, police. That Brockney got Scott on tape at midnight, only 7 hours after the initial call, was another important coup. By the next day, Lee Patterson was warning his son to refuse a polygraph. Had Brockney delayed, it's likely there would never have been a taped interview with Scott to show to a jury. Scott returned to his home after 4 a.m. on Christmas Day, only to find the exterior completely encircled in yellow crime scene tape. As he entered the empty house, the phone rang. It was Lacey's brother, Brett, asking him to come to his mother-in-law's house. Scott declined. Why wouldn't he want to be with family at a time like this? On Christmas morning, residents of the dusty Northern California city woke up to front page headline, "Woman vanishes on walk. Police start widespread search." On television, local stations were reporting that the search for the missing Modesto woman was intensifying. As over 24 police officers combed the La Loma neighborhood, Detective Brockney was knocking on doors. His first stop was 520 Covina, where he had met a neighbor, her roommate, Tara Venable, and Venable's 12-year-old son, Michael Thomas. When asked if they had seen anything out of the ordinary, Krigbum spoke up. She recalled being awakened around 10:30 on Christmas Eve morning by a neighbor's dog barking. She could not be sure exactly whose dog was making the noise. The woman hadn't seen Lacey walking in some time, they told police. They assumed it was due to her advanced pregnancy. "We sometimes feel sorry for Lacey because she is alone so often," Krigbaum said. Scott traveled a lot and occasionally spent a night away or more away from home on business. In a second interview with Detective Brockney, Krigbaum would recall that when Lacey Peterson was at home and awake, her typical routine was to rise her 2 front window shades in the morning and lower them in the evening when the sun went down. On Christmas Eve morning, Krigbum observed the shades were not raised. She simply assumed that Scott and Lacey were away. When she put her Christmas turkey in the oven around 1:15 that afternoon, Scott's truck was not in the driveway, and the shades of the house were still drawn. Around 4:25 p.m., Krigbaum went to the Save Mart for marshmallows. She estimated she was gone about 20 minutes. When she returned home, Scott's pickup was backed into the Petersons' driveway, an unusual way for him to park. At 5:30, Scott appeared at her door, asking if she had seen Lacey. Scott said he'd been trying to call his wife all day on her cell, but could not get an answer. He appeared nervous and volunteered that he had been out golfing all day. She watched Scott walk over to another neighbor's home and then saw him return home a few minutes later. Brockney next interviewed the Peterson maid, Margarita Nava, at the home of the Huarina Drive. As Scott said, she was hired only 6 weeks earlier. The 23rd was her third visit to the residence. She arrived at 8:45 a.m. and finished her clothes about 2 o'clock that afternoon. And finished her chores about 2 o'clock that afternoon. Lacey was in the house that day, and according to Nava, she complained about feeling extremely tired. The housekeeper didn't believe that Lacey would have walked the dog in her fatigued condition, but she didn't believe the Petersons were having any trouble in their marriage. Having watched the couple work together on their nursery, she thought that both were very excited at the prospect of a baby. Brockney asked about the very dirty towels he had observed atop the Petersons' washing machine. Nava explained that she'd used them to clean the outside of the window frames and the inside of the fireplace screen. "Where did you leave the towels?" "I left them in a bucket so that they could be washed at a later date." Yet Scott had told the police he'd found the towels inside the washing machine. A seemingly minor discrepancy, but someone took them out of the bucket to fill it with water. Was this at Lacey's request, or did Scott have some cleaning of his own to do? By 11:30 a.m., Brockney called Detective Craig Gorgon and requested that the Homicide Division become officially involved in the investigation. Modesto cops would see it as a lucky break when Grogan was next up on the rotation. Like Brockney, Grogan was a seasoned professional. Fellow officers in the department had nothing but praise for the stocky detective with thinning hair and a bushy mustache who joined the Modesto's Crimes Against Persons Unit in 1998 after 13 years of policing. Besides investigating homicides, kidnappings, sexual assaults, and other violent crimes, Gorgon's duties included missing persons cases. Technically, Grogan shouldn't have been available to take the Peterson case. 2 days earlier, a store owner had been shot and killed, a robber, A store owner had shot and killed a robber, but Grogan knew it was a case requiring little to no effort, so instead of taking it himself, he let the patrol officer handle it. Many investigators would have wanted the open and shut case to get off the bubble, that is, to move to the end of the rotation. Interestingly, the next officer on the rotation was in the middle of a contentious divorce. It would have been difficult for him to commit the time and attention to the Peterson case that the Peterson case would require. What Grogan didn't foresee was just how much the intense investigation would test his marriage. Grogan, who lived on a ranch a good distance outside of town with his wife and 2 small children, would miss his children's birthdays while working on the case. On countless occasions, he was forced to tell his wife he was too busy to take her calls. Outside observers rarely understand the toll that these cases take on the officers and their own families. As Grogan caught up with the details of Lacey's disappearance, other investigators hit the pavement. Detective John Bauer knocked on Karen Serva's door just before noon. Servas, the Petersons' next-door neighbor, had already told police how she discovered Mackenzie the previous morning. Now she gave her official report. Around 10:30 that morning, about the same time that the other neighbors, Amy Krigham and Tara Venable, had heard the dog barking, Servas was backing out of her driveway. She spotted the golden retriever standing near the street. Checking his tags to make sure it was Mackenzie, she decided to take him home. The Petersons' front gate was locked, so Servas circled around the second gate near the swimming pool. Seeing nothing unusual, she left the dog in the yard. She did not notice his leash was very dirty, so she did notice that his leash was very dirty, and so much so that she went back into her own home to wash her hands before getting back in her car to run errands. She recalled a man walking near her car at the time, but noticing nothing unusual or alarming about him. Concerned for Lacey's safety, Bauer pressed Servas for more information. From what he learned about her family life, it didn't seem likely that she would simply leave the home without notice. Service described her relationship with Scott Peterson as warm and friendly. She and her 10-year-old son were frequently invited to swim at the Petersons' pool. From time to time, Scott helped her with chores and repairs around her house. She described the couple as active and upbeat. They enjoyed entertaining at their home and appeared to have a good relationship. Service had seen Lacey and Scott on Sunday, the 22nd, when they told her that the baby was a boy. They were planning to name him Connor. Hey, Connor. When he finished with Karen Service, Detective Bauer joined Al Brockney to check out several homeless encampments along the south side of Dry Creek Park. The area was a scattered of small tents with clothing hanging from the trees, bags of rubbish, old wet mattresses, and plastic tarps amid the camping supplies and broken down barbecues. When nothing appeared to be related to Lacey's disappearance, the officers left the area and went their separate ways. At 1 p.m., Bauer joined Grogan and Doug Mansfield, an agent from the California Department of Justice, at the division office. Scott's polygraph was scheduled for that afternoon, and Mansfield was there to assist with the test. As the men talked, Bauer received a phone call. Scott Peterson had changed his mind, claiming that his father, Lee, suggested that the exam was not a good idea. It was one of the many promises Scott would make during the case that failed to keep up. I suspect that Scott never intended to take the polygraph and that his father merely provided the perfect excuse when he advised him against it. Scott never seemed concerned that he would have to face up to his lies, sometimes only hours after making them. Whatever new problem he'd created for himself, it seemed his only concern was putting off any reckoning just a little longer. Knowing that Scott was at the police headquarters attending to a press conference that afternoon, the officers walked over to confront him in person. Once inside, Gorkin strode over to Scott Peterson and introduced himself. Grogan said that he'd been assigned as the lead investigator on the case and wanted to familiarize himself with him and the members of Lacey's family. Whether or not Scott decided to take the polygraph, Grogan added, there were additional questions that detectives needed to ask. Scott didn't have to agree to an interview and was free to leave, but his assistance would be appreciated. Scott said he would stay, telling Grogan he wanted to help. Scott followed Grogan, Detective Bauer, and Agent Mansfield to the interrogation room. Some of the rooms had audio and video facilities, but since Scott had already completed a taped interview with Brockney, Grogan chose a regular conference room. This was likely a misstep on Grogan's part. From the start, I believe that Scott's own words and his inconsistencies were the most damning things about him. Every time Scott was recorded, his words and mannerisms came back to haunt him. Sadly, the tape interviews have become especially critical today as the public has grown increasingly suspicious of the police. Once upon a time, when an officer took the stand, his uniform gave him instant credibility. Nowadays, it seems that the police testimony is considered suspect until substantiated by clear forensic evidence or audio-visual corroboration. At trial, Grogan would rely on his notes, but if this interview had been on tape, I believe his testimony would have been unimpeachable. Scott was asked to give the officers some background about his relationship with Lacey. He told them about meeting her in California Polytech University in San Luis Obispo. They were married on August 9, 1997, and moved to Modesto 2 years ago. Lacey was pregnant with their first child, a boy. Scott appeared to be close to Lacey's family. He referred to Sharon Rocha as Mom, but Lacey's biological father, Dennis Rocha, who lived in Escalon, California, Escalon? Escalon, Escalon, California, had little contact with the family. Scott described his wife as outgoing and told the investigators she'd recently left her job as a substitute teacher in the Sylvan School District. He gave the police names of her two closest friends, Stacy Boyers and Renee Tomlinson. As a manager and fertilizer salesman of Trade Corp, Scott traveled extensively. Although his hours were flexible, he generally left for work around 9:30 every morning. Trade Corp wanted him to work from an office in Fresno, but he and Lacey had selected Modesto because her family was nearby. Next, Scott described 3 days leading up to Lacey's disappearance. He could recall nothing out of the ordinary, he said. He occupied himself with yard work, a little golf, and some gym time at the Tona del Rio County Club, eating at home, and renting movies. On Monday, December 23rd, Scott arrived at his office about 10 o'clock and worked until about 2 in the afternoon. Lacey went to her noon maternity yoga class, and later that afternoon, Scott joined her for an OBGYN appointment. Scott told the police that his baby's heart rate was 150 beats per minute. They'd asked the doctor to reveal the child's sex months earlier because Lacey didn't want to wait. Scott dropped Lacey off at home and went to the gym from 4 to 5 in the afternoon, stopped by his office for the mail, and then returned home. Early that evening, they'd taken a trip to Salon, where Lacey's sister worked as a stylist. Amy cut Scott's hair while showing Lacey how to trim his hair at home. Scott didn't mention that Lacey had bought her own curling iron along to the salon for some individual instruction, seemingly a minor detail, yet one would become relevant to the trial in determining whether Lacey was alive the next morning. The Petersons' housekeeper told the police she'd put the curling iron in the cabinet when she cleaned on the 23rd, yet official photographs revealed that it was resting on the sink the morning Lacey disappeared. Scott's defense team would use the picture to argue that Lacey was obviously alive that morning and used the iron to style her hair. Yet the prosecution was able to show that she'd actually removed it from the cabinet the night before she took it to the salon. After the haircut, the couple got some pizza at Mountain Mike's and watched The Rookie on tape, and were in bed at the usual time. Scott then described the crucial morning hours on December 24th. Lacey was already up, he said, and he had gotten out of bed around 8 a.m. Scott recalled that she was marinating French toast in Grand Marnier for the Christmas brunch. Remember, there was never any testimony about the contents of the Peterson refrigerator to confirm or deny this assertion. Had the officers checked the refrigerator, it might have helped to prove or disprove Scott's story about their activities on that morning. Scott told the investigators that Lacey was wearing a plain white sleeve pullover shirt with a crew neck and black maternity pants with an elastic waistband. Once again, he repeated her schedule. The plan to walk McKinsey, go grocery shopping, then bake gingerbread that afternoon. Despite her casual attire, Scott said, Lacey was wearing a pair of diamond earrings, a golden diamond wristwatch, and a diamond solitaire around her neck. Some of the items, he said, she'd recently inherited from her grandmother. Her wedding ring was at the local jewelry store being revoked to include her grandma's stones. The cost of this work was one of Scott's Christmas presents to Lacey. If there were other presents, they never were found. The police who checked the presents under the Petersons' tree were especially attentive to any gifts from Scott to Lacey. After all, if you're planning to kill your wife, why spend money on presents she's never going to open? Scott next described Lacey's normal exercises routine for the morning to the officers. She would walk in the morning after the frost, entering the park from the north end of Covina Avenue. She would turn right or eastbound toward the tennis courts and then complete a half-mile loop before returning home. The walk generally took about 45 minutes, he said, and she always took Mackenzie with her. The dog wasn't particularly protective of Scott, but Lacey was a different story. He told Brockney that he'd once warned the pool guy not to get in between her and the dog. Lacey didn't generally carry around pepper spray or a cell phone with her when she walked. Although he'd already told Brockney that it was unusual for her to leave her house without locking the door, he now said that Lacey sometimes left the door unlocked. It was after breakfast when Scott decided to go fishing at Berkeley Marina. He researched the area on the internet after purchasing his boat 2 weeks earlier. When asked if Lacey had ever gone fishing with him, Scott said only once. On their very first date, about 8 years ago, he had taken her out on the water for a deep sea fishing trip, and she became very seasick. Lacey refused to ever go out boating again. This incident would give rise to one of the most poignant statements made by Sharon Rocha during the statement phase of Scott's trial. Scott told the cops that he was sure he'd left the house around 9:30. Martha Stewart was on TV at the time talking about meringue and cookies, the fact that would prove embarrassing at the prosecution trial, but would also provide a devastating timeline to be used against the defense. That Tuesday morning was his first outing with the new boat. On the 22nd, he had obtained a 2-day license and some fishing lures. At Big 5 Sporting Goods just hours before, Scott had been unable to give Officer Evers even the sketchiest account of his plans. Now with Grogan, he was very detailed. He would be fishing for sturgeon and stripper in the bay. When he got to the warehouse, Scott said he checked his email. There was a reminder to ship a golf bag he had recently sold on eBay. Scott also sent a holiday note to his employer. He said that, as he said before, he then assembled a woodworking tool called a mortiser, look at me, learning new words. A strange use of his time for a man heading out on a fishing trip. Finally, he cleaned up the office, unloaded tools from his toolbox, and hooked up his boat. He left for the bay shortly after 11 o'clock. When Agent Mansfield asked if he had called Lacey before leaving the office, Scott replied that he never spoke to his wife while at work. While the timing of the emails could be determined, there was never any proof that Scott was cleaning or assembling tools while at his office. The prosecution would argue that he used these moments to hide Lacey's body between the boat seats, then covered the boat with the brown tarp originally discovered in the back of his pickup. Once again, Scott described his drive along Highway 132 and 580 and the I-80 North interchange. He recalled reaching the Berkeley Marina at about 1 o'clock, putting $5 into the Iron Ranger automated parking meter and collecting a time parking receipt. He loaded 2 fishing rods and a tackle box into the boat, but forgot the brand new lures that he had purchased only 2 days earlier. When questioning why he had not brought any food or water, Scott said that he knew time was limited. The main mission was simply to get the boat in the water. Scott claimed that he'd stayed out for about an hour, powered by a 15 horsepower engine. He motored northwest until he reached a shallow area along a trash-filled island with a posting that said no landing. He had no problem trolling for sturgeon, although he had forgotten the saltwater lures. According to Scott, the weather turned bad and it began to rain, so he returned to the marina. While loading his boat, he ran the trailer into the dock, giving several bystanders a laugh. Once on the road, he called his wife. It was 2:15 when he left the "Hey beautiful" message at home, then another on Lacey's cell phone with the dead battery. Traffic delays in Pleasanton and Livermore showed his return. He wasted more time by stopping for $13 worth of gas, duly noted on his debit card. Realizing he would never make it back in time to pick up the gift basket before 4 o'clock, he placed another call to Lacey. Again, no answer. Driving at 55 miles per hour because he was towing a trailer, Scott said he arrived at the warehouse at about 4:30 p.m. Quickly disconnecting the boat, he was back on the road within 5 minutes. Moments later, he arrived home to find Mackenzie still wearing his leash and the back door unlocked. For the second time in less than 24 hours, Scott described what he did next, an account that still doesn't make sense to me. The dark, empty house set off no alarms in the young man's mind. Instead of looking around for Lacey, he had a casual snack, washed some clothes, and took a shower. These were the actions of a father-to-be with a seriously pregnant wife who should have been home to greet him. Before he could describe his call with Sharon Rocha, the investigators asked Scott about his overall relationship with Lacey. "It was good," he responded. "The couple never shouted at each other or fought. They were both in good physical health. Lacey took only prenatal pills, neither had any medical problems or a history of mental illness. They lived on a budget and saved money by eating most meals at home. The local Barnes & Noble store was a favorite hunt. Just 2 weeks before his wife's disappearance, the couple had stopped there to buy children's book for their unborn son. While Scott took care of finances and paid household bills, Lacey was a good money manager. She didn't make extravagant purchases." He added that she was pleased he'd bought the boat and become a member of Del Rio Country Club. When Scott laid out the family finances, however, the picture was one of a couple living from paycheck to paycheck. Scott's currently monthly income was around $5,000 plus roughly $1,400 in travel reimbursements. Yet his regular expenses, as he outlined, nearly equaled his salary. All right, I'm going to add these in the description, but I'm going to read you a list. Okay. $1,250 a month for the house payment, $650 a month for the truck payment, $750 a month for the credit card payment, $500 a month for the home improvement payment, $600 a month for food bills, $390 a month for the club payment, $300 a month for retirement installments, $240 a month for a life insurance bill, $150 for utilities, $50 a month cell phone bills. The Petersons' monthly outlay totaled at least $4,880, just $200 less than Scott's salary. Their savings hovered around $2,000. Lacey had quit working and expressed no desire to resume an outside job. Although testimony at trial did not support financial motive for murder, the young couple was spending almost everything they brought in. Their accumulated savings left little to pay for a new infant, especially when it came clear how much money Scott was spending on extracurricular activities. Asking to elaborate about the life insurance expenses, Scott told police that he had a whole life plan and immediately recited his agent's name and phone number. Lacey had a separate policy, but he couldn't remember the payment amount. Although Scott traveled extensively on his own, he and Lacey did vacation together on occasion. In August, Scott went to the Cliffs, a resort in Avila Beach in San Luis Obispo, with a friend. 4 months earlier, he and Lacey had gone to Hawaii with another couple. The couple spent a few days in Carmel with Scott's parents just a few weeks before she disappeared, and he described the 3 overseas business trips he'd taken himself that year, all for corporate settings. Margarita, who came Monday mornings at 9:30 and left around 2 in the afternoon, was the only person Scott recalled. Before her, his in-laws, Sharon and Ron, had been the last people to visit. Scott told the officers he had never been in a fight in his life and had no criminal history. "What about all the guns?" Brockney asked. Scott listed his weapons: a .22 caliber, which Detective Brockney confiscated, a 20 gauge Browning, a .22 Ruger, a 223 Ruger, a 12 gauge semi-automatic Browning, a 12 gauge semi-automatic Mossberg, a 12 gauge side-by-side Ithaca, a 12 gauge semi-automatic Smith Wesson. Scott said that he last fired a gun while pheasant hunting in November. The 12 millimeter, the 22, what's it called? Sorry. Oop. The 22, what are we looking at? Was confiscated by Brockney from his glove box. Scott reported the millimeter Glock as stolen from his car outside the Firestone tire store in 2001. Scott sued the store over theft, his first small claims suit, and collected $700 from the company. The detectives finally asked what Scott thought happened to Lacey. By then, Scott had settled on the idea that a transient had assaulted her in the park, probably because of her expensive jewelry. Recently, he told the detectives his wife had become concerned about stories of rape and assaults in the park. She'd started thinking about carrying pepper spray on her walks, but she never did. The 2 investigators tried to keep Scott talking. Did the couple have any future plans? Scott said that he and Lacey intended to move to San Luis Obispo when Connor began school. He wanted to buy an olive ranch. Grogan remarked that Scott seemed very poised in social settings. He must be a very successful businessman. Scott smiled and thanked him, saying it was important to have those skills in the sales business. Did Lacey ever embarrass him in social situations? Not at all, Scott replied. She was actually quite helpful. The interview concluded around 4:30 p.m. and Detective Grogan learned that Scott's parents were downstairs demanding to see their son. Grogan accompanied Scott to the waiting room. Lee Peterson told the detectives they had driven up from San Diego to help their son. Tall, slender, and slightly stooped, Lee said that Scott should not be interviewed without an attorney present. Grogan responded that his son had declined to take a polygraph and that might exclude him as a suspect. Before his father could speak, Scott again refused the test. What did Lee Peterson know? Cops said he was suspicious of his son. Leaving the Petersons, Grogan returned to the bureau to compare notes with Brockney and Bueller. The detectives found several inconsistencies in their respective conversations with the young man. Their suspicions were heightened when Brockney added that the boat patrol officer at the Berkeley Marina reported that there had been absolutely no rain on Christmas Day. It was time to put Scott under the microscope. Grogan prepared a search warrant for Scott's home, business, vehicles, and boat. They would serve warrants the very next day. Then at 4:30, Brockney's cell phone rang. It was Scott Peterson wanting a progress report. Officers did a grid search last night and then repeated it today, Detective Brockney said. There are 3 dog teams there. Mounted sheriffs are coming over. The sheriff's helicopter was also searching the area with a heat detector. Have you used cadaver dogs yet? Scott asked. The detective was shocked. Cadaver dogs are used for sniffing out dead bodies, Brockney explained. Have you already given up on finding Lacey alive? Have a good day.